It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MEP Daniel Hannan, Labour peer Lord Adonis, Theresa May's former Director of Communications Katie Perrier, and spiked online columnist Ella Whelan. So, what's going on today?
We are a Remain and Reform party, but obviously when it comes to a deal, people could form their own view.
If Labour's deputy leader is right, why would the party do a deal with the Tories to get Brexit over the line?
My 6-year-old actually couldn't wait to go into school on Friday morning last week to say it's mummy counsellor now, it's not mummy.
Why independents were the big winners at the local elections? Fancy £16,000 a year from the government? No questions asked. We'll tell you how. Right, let's start with those cross-party talks resuming this week. The question to all of you is, Daniel Hannan, starting with you, will they last the week?
No, I think Labour's now made it very clear that they don't want a deal without a second referendum attached. The People's Party is openly disdaining the people. Labour will do anything for the working man except listen to him. And that makes it pointless to carry on with the talks, since plainly there isn't going to be any room for an agreement there. So if there has to be another parliamentary vote, let's hold the wretched thing. If not, let's drop the pretence and move on.
Do you think the cross-party talks have any chance of lasting the week and succeeding?
Well, the people can't betray the people, so it's absolutely the democratic thing for there to be a second referendum on any Brexit deal, including one from Theresa May. But on the talks themselves, I see that Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, said in Brussels earlier this morning that there were discussions going on, and whilst it was the government's position that they didn't want to see a second referendum, these negotiations would continue. So it sounds as if Daniel's party isn't being as categoric in its denial of the possibility of a deal as he might think. And it's been clear for a long time what the compromise would be, that Parliament agrees to pass her deal because otherwise Theresa May will have no way forward at all, but in return for a second referendum with an option to remain. And that's looking more and more clear that it's a likely
But just to be clear, there would therefore be no leave option on the ballot paper. It would be a choice between a deal that leavers regard as worse than either staying or leaving or remaining.
But maybe
an actual clean break wouldn't be on the ballot paper.
That's what Daniel thinks, but that's not the case, of course. There would obviously be a remain option on the ballot paper.
Do you think the talks will last the week, Katie?
No, and I think the patience is really running out from the Conservative Party end, and there's pressure on the Prime Minister now to say, how much longer are you going to put faith into these talks to say that you're going to get something out of the end of it? Because you lose faith the longer it goes on, because one way or another it has to come to an end. And I think we are seeing the end of days now, and it's about what comes next.
Right, but the noise is that actually there is a point to these talks, that they have been serious and they've been done in good faith.
Oh yeah, but that's what they'd say, isn't it? I mean, they want to seem like they are doing something, both sides, but these talks should never have taken place from my point of view in the first place, because it was all about both Labour and Conservatives trying to come together to find a way to best scupper Brexit, however you look at it. From this Leaver's point of view, any outcome that does anything other than honour the referendum and accept the referendum and implement the referendum in its fullness is a sellout. So whether we are facing a confirmatory referendum, which would be a complete dishonest approach to democracy and a travesty, or it's some kind of Frankenstein's monster of a deal, Leavers lose out.
Hold on a minute, Theresa May can't win either way, because we moaned that she didn't do anything to engage with people all the way through the first part of the process and tried to get her deal through herself, and now we moan that she tries to reach out across Parliament to try and engage. So she can't win on this and needs to decide whether or not she thinks she could be rescued by the Labour Party or she needs to go on regardless.
Well, we're going to talk about this in some detail. Let's show our viewers the Guardian newspaper. Second Brexit referendum key to deal, says Starmer, Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary. I'm going to talk to Andrew Adonis for a while. Just a few questions before I open it up to everybody else. Do you agree with Keir Starmer that there are about 150 MPs or so on the Labour side that would not agree to any Brexit deal unless it includes a second referendum?
I entirely agree. And indeed, I think that underestimates the number, because on the 1st of April, more than 200 Labour MPs voted for there to be a referendum on any Brexit deal with an option to remain, any Brexit deal. So I think it's unsustainable for there to be an agreement.
So you
about
don't think
referendum.
there
I
are
also think
any
it's the obvious
circumstances,
compromise.
right, so there are no circumstances at all in which Labour would assist the Conservatives in delivering Brexit or a Brexit deal without a second referendum?
Well, I was simply saying what I think the majority of Labour MPs, what their view would be. And I think the great majority of Labour MPs would not agree to any Brexit deal without there being a referendum with an option to remain. It's very clear now that you couldn't conceivably hold a referendum where the only choice is the least popular things in the country, which
So
are different
you
forms
would
of Brexit.
categorise the Labour Party as the party of a second referendum, Remain and Reform, says Tom Watson.
I completely agree with Tom.
All
I think Tom is
There you
speaking.
have it.
Tom is speaking for the Labour
And you
All
Party.
right,
see
well,
the
you said-
fundamental dishonesty there.
Well,
right?
hang on,
At the
I'm gonna-
2017 election, all those Labour MPs were returned to Parliament on the basis of a clear manifesto promise that they would respect the result. Now, in fairness, the SNP, the Greens, the Lib Dems, they all said they were going to overturn it. They all lost votes in consequence. But Labour told an outright lie. They said, we will respect the referendum result, and they now turns out they had their fingers
Right, well,
crossed
hang on a
behind their
second,
backs.
Andrew. Hang on. You've made it very clear, and Dan obviously disagrees. You've made it very clear that in your mind, Labour is the party of the second referendum and Remain. In fact, you went even further last year on LBC. Let's just have a listen.
If you're a Brexiter, I hope you won't vote for the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is moving increasingly against Brexit.
30 to 40%
So,
of
as
Labour Party voters support
Yeah, but
Brexit.
well, by definition, therefore, the majority who are against Brexit, if one does the maths on that here.
So why would any Labour Leave voter support you when you say you are fully committed to a second referendum and Remain?
If we have a referendum, everyone who voted Leave or Remain 3 years ago gets their say. So I hope that Leavers and Remainers will vote Labour in the European elections, because it's the only way that they will get their own say.
Why would they not vote for the Brexit Party? I mean, Andrew Jones,
Well, the
why would
Brexit Party is-
anybody who wants to vote Leave and who wants the UK to leave in the way that they said they were promised and they said clearly in that referendum, why would they vote for Labour? You've just said we're the party of Remain and a second referendum.
The Brexit Party isn't offering people a say at all. The Brexit Party just wants an impossible position, which is a no-deal Brexit, to be adopted, even though there are virtually no votes in Parliament for it.
But
I mean, Daniel's party
you've
doesn't
told
support a no-deal
Labour,
Brexit.
you've told Labour
So-
Leave voters not to bother voting
No,
for
La-
the Labour Party. You've told anybody who wants to leave, who's a Brexiter, not to vote for the Labour Party. You've said you're the party of Remain and a second referendum. Why would anybody who wants to leave the EU vote for Labour?
I've answered that question very clearly. If there's a referendum, then people who voted
They
Leave
don't want a
and
referendum.
Remain, they do. The great majority of people do want a referendum. That's very clear from the polling. And if there's a referendum, people who voted Leave and Remain both get their
All right.
say, and they get an equal say.
Well,
And those who want a no-deal Brexit, which is what the Brexit Party is campaigning for at the moment, the only way it's going to be possible to get that is through a referendum, because there's no way that the current
All right.
House of Commons
Is Labour,
vote for
though,
that,
is
because it's,
Labour, though, in favour of a second referendum in the way that you have stated? I mean, you've made it pretty categorical. I've looked at your leaflet in the European elections and your manifesto. I really struggled to find any mention of a second referendum. There's one mention of a public vote
It's the key mention, which is that on any deal from this government. But what Keir was saying in The Guardian this morning, which you asked me about earlier, what Keir was saying is that he finds it inconceivable that there could be an agreement with the government.
But that's what
an
Keir Starmer
agreement
said.
between the
But it's
parties,
about-
which didn't have
Well,
a
hang on,
referendum.
let's just see
There-
what
there
Labour's
wouldn't be a
actually
majority in the House of
saying.
Commons for it.
You're saying one thing. Let's have a look at the European manifesto from the Labour Party. Labour will continue to oppose the government's bad deal or a disastrous no deal. And if we can't get agreement along the lines of our alternative plan or a general election, so if they do get agreement, they won't back the option of a public vote.
They don't say that. No, the words don't say that.
If we can't get agreement
say,
along the lines of our alternative plan or a general election, only then will Labour back a public vote. So it's not in all
Hold on.
circumstances.
We don't say whether or not in the manifesto there would be a referendum on any deal other than the government's. That would need to be decided at the time. What Keir was saying this morning is that he believes that the great majority of Labour MPs would want a referendum in those circumstances. However, if there's Theresa May's deal proceeds, and let's be clear, that is the only deal on the table.
No, but hang on.
There's no
but
other
that
deal
is-
on the table.
I'm sorry,
then
Andrew.
we
You're
support a
not
referendum
being. You're
with an
not being
option
honest.
to remain.
In your leaflet, it says if we can't get changes to their bad deal or a
Yeah.
general election,
i.e. Theresa May's deal.
but changes to the deal. That's why the talks are continuing. Then Labour would back the option of a public vote. It's not guaranteed.
But you're making my point that the only deal on the table at the moment is Theresa May's deal. That deal, we support a referendum with an option to remain. If there were to be some alternative deal, obviously we'd have to take a view at the time. And what Keir Starmer and Tom Watson have been saying
Right, so it's not
is that he thinks
guaranteed.
the great majority of
But it's not
Labour MPs
guaranteed.
would support
Let's have a look at
referendum.
your Twitter page where you say the choice is between Nigel Farage and Brexit, or People's Vote and Labour. But that is disingenuous. That is not what Labour is saying, as has been demonstrated by the manifesto and the leaflet. If Labour get changes to the deal, then Brexit will happen along Labour lines. There'll be no second referendum.
The only deal on the table at the moment is Theresa May's deal. It's been voted down by the House of Commons 3 times, and Labour has voted now not only against Theresa May's deal 3 times, but for a
All right, so
referendum
why is it not
twice.
emblazoned
So-
across the front of your manifesto and the front of your leaflet?
Well, we simply-
Second referendum under Labour.
Well, I wish it was, because that is our policy, is that on Theresa May's deal, we support a referendum. Instead, we have Jeremy's picture, and that's great, because Jeremy is the leader of our party. So instead, we've got Jeremy emblazoned. But that's fantastic. But on the actual policy matter that,
You say he's
that affects
fantastic.
us at the
But
moment...
you say he's fantastic, but you
We support a
tweeted earlier this year the only thing that could lead the independent group to become a viable party is Jeremy Corbyn literally forcing the sensible left out of the Labour Party by continuing to condone Brexit and anti-Semitism. The trouble is, he's doing a very good job of
No,
this.
Jeremy's not doing that.
Right, you've changed your
No,
mind. You've changed
Jeremy-
your mind since February.
No, what Jeremy has done has led us 3 times to vote against Theresa May's deal and twice to back a referendum. On the 1st of April, the last time the House of Commons voted on a
What's
referendum...
changed since February
we
from your
voted-
tweet?
Oh, the way that Jeremy's led the party. In the 1st of April, he led more than 200 Labour MPs to vote for a referendum on any Brexit deal with an option to remain. So the only way we're going to get Remain and a referendum is by supporting Labour in these elections.
Really, if you were a Remain supporter and you really wanted a second referendum, why wouldn't you support Change UK?
Because they've
Or
got,
the Liberal Democrats?
Because they've got tiny support in the House of Commons and the country. If you actually want to bring about change, then you have to support Labour in this election.
This is
It's only
just
Labour
painful.
that-
I mean, I've been on the opposite side from Lord Adonis for years, but I actually just find it painful. I wonder whether Seamus Milne and Jeremy Corbyn haven't put him on the list for the sole purpose of torturing and humiliating him by making him say all of these things and disavow all the stuff that he'd been saying up until now, which is that the only issue that counted was stopping a referendum. I mean, it's just painful to watch. But the one thing I really wanted to pick up was his idea that it's either Labour or the Brexit Party. There must be space for people who want Brexit to happen in a liberal, agreed, orderly and grown-up way. Not every lever is for the hardest kind of aggressive future relationship with the EU. Most of the people who voted Leave want to have good and cordial relations with our European neighbours after we've left, and there must be a space. The reason why I decided I had to stand again, there must be a space for people to say vote Brexit and vote for it to happen in a friendly, orderly and swift way.
Ella?
I applaud your attempt to make a case for the Conservative view of Brexit. I think that's quite honestly saying that that's a long shot at this point. I want to come back on the second referendum point. I mean, fair enough, asking a lord to understand and defend democracy is a bit like asking a butcher to campaign for veganism. It's not your shtick. I mean, I know that you don't quite get it, but let me put it to you this way. If we have a confirmatory vote, a second referendum, a people's vote, however you want to dress it up, what that is saying is you're asking voters to beg for their political views. And there's no guarantee that that wouldn't happen again and again and again. We have already had, I know you're sort of sick of hearing this by now, but I'm going to be one of those pesky voters that reminds you of what happened in 2016. We had this vote, we had our say, and it is now incumbent on politicians to implement that vote. What we have at the moment is parties vying for the power of how best to completely rewrite history and pretend like that didn't happen.
You're going to vote for the Brexit Party?
I'm going to vote for the Brexit Party, and I tell you that was a hard decision for me to make as someone on the left, because I'm ashamed and appalled by the fact that the left has so exited this discussion in relation to the Euroscepticism on the left as something now that's seen as, it was a central tenet of left-wing viewpoints. But the reason I'm voting for the Brexit Party is because it is putting forward a clear message on democracy, the key issue of our time, and Brexit is what has galvanised politics and is what interests people. And if you don't understand that, then you may as well leave politics.
What do you say listening to that, Katie? And also, if you look at the latest opinion poll, which puts the Brexit Party on 34%, with Labour tracking behind on 21%.
I think it's tapped into the angry nature of the electorate right now, they're not just angry because Brexit has not been implemented. They're angry because our politicians are all having a row within ourselves inside the Westminster bubble, and we are not reaching them. If you live in Hull or Middlesbrough, you might as well live in France or Germany right now, for the fact that we feel so far apart from where we are. And we need to work out a way together, not just the Conservative Party, but across the board, because the Labour Party has shown today you're as split on the issue as Brexit as anybody else is in Parliament right now. And, you know, it was painful listening to that interview, and it's painful to be at home listening to all of this going on week after week after week. Every week people open up the Sunday papers and think, right, well, this is the week something's got to happen. Something's got to break. You can't be in a cul-de-sac forever. There must be a way out. And every week we find ourselves stuck in exactly the same point.
Well, and on that, and on the pain being felt by many people, Dan Hannan, you wrote an article in The Telegraph over the weekend calling on Theresa May to go. Why?
Well, by all the rules of politics, she should have gone, if not after the last election, then certainly when she suffered the worst parliamentary defeat in, 700 and whatever years of parliamentary history. It seems to me that the process of recovery for the Conservative Party, but more important, the process of getting an equitable deal that works for both sides on Brexit can't begin until there is someone else in place. And unless this issue is addressed within the next few days, I'm not sure there is going to be a Conservative Party left to inherit for whoever the successor is.
Is that right?
I think that she needs to announce the date that she goes, whether or not that's, very soon, or whether or not that's a couple of months' time. I can't believe we will be heading to Conservative Party conference in the autumn, and she's going to put herself up in front of those people which are likely to slow clap her, turn their backs on her, tell her that she's not the leader of their party that they want. And I think that between now and then, we have to have a moment for departure, a clear time for a decent leadership contest. I was asked the other day, do we have as a Conservative Party in us to be able to offer hope and vision for the future and a way through this? And I think we do, but we're running out of time.
And it requires someone with the ability to communicate, and this is what's been absent. I mean, actually, there's a fairly good story to tell in normal times, right? The deficit is back to pre-Gordon Brown levels. There are more people working than ever. School standards are rising, wages are rising. But you need someone able to communicate a sense of vision.
Who would that be, Dan?
Well, as soon as you start picking sides there, everything else you say is discounted. So I'm going to leave that one to the MPs. I don't get a vote here.
What we're hearing is the implosion of the Conservative Party at the moment, because they want to pull the rug from under Theresa May. They can't say who else it should be, and they've got no way forward on Brexit.
And the Labour Party should be 20 points ahead right now. The Labour Party should be 20 points ahead right now, and it really is a massive failure of leadership to not be ahead of this government in its current state.
There's no greater failure of leadership than not fulfilling properly the office of Prime Minister.
Yes, but as the recent elections in the local showed, you weren't making gains in the way that you should have been as an opposition party. But let's return to the Tories. Well, absolutely. I mean, they got a mauling at 1,300 seats being lost. But Dan Hannan, you say that the Tories' problem is the leader, and that Theresa May should go in a matter of days.
Yes.
In your mind. Do you then think the rules need to change in terms of getting rid of her?
If she won't step down voluntarily, then yes. I mean, otherwise the whole party gets judged. It's like the ancient mariners' crewmates. They make themselves accomplices if they don't act. The cabinet, the 22, the parliamentary party, somebody has to change the rules and move if she won't go herself, which I still think would be by far the best thing. She did, by the way. I mean, the absurdity of all this is everyone agrees that she should go soon, including, in theory, Mrs May. Right? She said, I don't want to lead us into another European election. I won't be the Prime Minister who's there if Brexit hasn't happened by June. So we're only arguing about a few weeks. That's the preposterousness of this. But those few weeks may make all the difference.
I'm not a fan of changing the rules. I don't like changing the rules while you're in the game. I think that's pretty poor form. I hope that she will listen to cabinet colleagues who are kind of saying to her, time is starting to be up now. We've tried every possible route. We've allowed you time to negotiate with Labour Party, even though we've taken a knock for it. Speaking to local councillors out on the ground in the last few weeks, they are livid that Theresa May has been negotiating Brexit with the Labour Party, and they're pretty furious about it. So I think that hopefully they will be protecting the party just as much as protecting her.
At the risk of being the one that sounds a bit soft on Theresa May, I just don't see what this would change. I mean, the idea that it would take someone who would be a better communicator. I mean, you have to have a good message to communicate. And at the moment, the Conservative Party, neither the Labour Party, have a good message to communicate. The message that people are crying out for is one of democracy, and both parties are failing on that.
All right, well, let's have a look at some of the polling. In fact, we're going to have a look at an average of European election polling. I think we can show you and our viewers. Brexit Party on 30%, Labour on 24% and the Conservatives on 13%, Lib Dems on 13%. We're going to talk to Andrew Hawkins from Comres. They carried out a poll that featured in the Telegraph over the weekend. Just give us a sort of summary of those polls ahead of the European elections.
Well, for the European election voting intention poll, we had the Conservatives, alarmingly for them, in fourth place on just 11%, and the Brexit Party up at 28%. The real worry, I think, for the Conservatives, though, is that we put them in third place behind the Brexit Party. The Conservative vote share that we had was the lowest of any pollster since January 1995, and if it was to translate into a general election, of course it is only a snapshot in time, but if it were to translate into a general election number of seats in the House of Commons, then the Brexit Party would be winning almost 50.
Right, and we're just showing our guests and our viewers those figures there with Westminster voting intention. I mean, would a change of leader make any difference, Andrew?
We tested that as well. If there were any leadership candidates still with their seats after such a result, if they were to change riders now, the only potential leader that we tested who would come within a whisker of Labour for the Conservatives would be Boris Johnson, but the Conservative Party would still be behind Labour even if he were to become leader. And it's worth noting as well that Boris Johnson not only is the most popular, but he also polls as the least popular, so he receives the greatest dislike score.
Right. I mean, there are normal health warnings always, of course, with polls. And as you said, the Westminster voting intention is a snapshot. But it looks pretty terminal for the Conservatives if you take all these figures in the round.
I think it's really difficult. I mean, the first past the post will ride to their rescue, and it's worth looking back to what happened with the SDP alliance in the early 80s. One poll in 1981 gave the alliance 50% of the vote. In the 83 election, they were 2 percentage points behind Labour in the high 20s, but Labour won 10 times as many seats in Westminster as they did. We've still got the same electoral system in place, and that would doubtless work very hard against the Brexit Party's interests were they to be able to maintain this conjuring act of trying to levitate their vote share until the next election, whenever that happens to be.
Right. I mean, Dan Hannan, you also say in your article, Theresa May's refusal to go in the next 2 weeks really could mean the end of the Conservative Party after 200 years.
350 if you count the Tory prelude. Yeah.
Really? You see it as badly as
Yes. I mean, the idea that people are gaming this and saying, oh, well, you know, is what's the right time for my preferred candidate is terrifying. We're a two-party system. What happens, as Andrew Hawkins was saying just there, if one party loses, the other one wins. So the issue for people, by the way, the issue for people even voting next week is who do you want in charge? Who do you want in charge during the Brexit process? Do you want it to be Jeremy Corbyn or whoever takes over from Theresa May? And I mean, I'm very clear in my mind as to who would be better there. But there's the whole issue of do we really want the country led by someone who has never found an anti-British dictator that he doesn't support?
Katie?
I think the Conservative Party have been through many problems before, possibly not as serious as this issue in terms of Brexit, but it has got the ability to rebirth, reborn it, get through and change.
So it is in tatters in your mind, the brand?
Yes, I think the brand is in tatters. I think David Cameron's efforts to detoxify the party are shot to pieces now. And I'm afraid we have a real building exercise to go. But when you look at the Labour Party, I'm afraid that it's not like they're just, the voters are going, the alternative is so much better. We are rushing to the polls to get Jeremy Corbyn behind the door at number 10. That is not the case either.
I think this is the central question about what these elections will show is that voters are screaming out for something different. I mean, the Brexit Party, like the Molumptons, have just come out of sort of thin air. It's only recently announced itself, and people are flocking towards it. I don't think that's because it's running flashy campaigns or it's got loudspeakers at its events and it's got all of that going for it. It's because people really care about Brexit, and that's the central thing. And the most important thing,
I'm afraid. So you're one track party that doesn't do anything.
Perhaps, and I certainly am.
I think it's very dangerous.
I certainly am treating this as a vote on a single issue, and when it comes to general election, I might think very differently. But what people are sick of is being asked to vote for the best of the worst option. So playing politics, playing tactics, people don't want to do that anymore. They want to take up a central issue.
Katie, you
which is
say it's
democracy.
over then, but Nigel Farage has been talking about going beyond the European elections, going towards a general election. It may not be over in terms of the threat from the Brexit Party for the Conservatives.
It may not be over, but until I see policies and spending commitments on the NHS, on schools, on how you deal with adult social care, all the things that politicians have to deal with, I would only think there is one.
Or even Brexit. Beyond, I mean, of course, you don't need to be a brilliant analyst to work out that people voted Leave, we haven't left, and therefore people are going to vote for a party called Brexit. But I hope that people will also think about what happens next, right? I always saw Brexit not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. For me, the end is a freer and more democratic and more prosperous global Britain. And the reason I want to be in the European Parliament is to try and make that happen. And so you've got to think about, do we just get something off our chests? Or are we actually in this in terms of getting an outcome that is equitable?
Are we let people stand and put two fingers up in Parliament? Well, that's not really good for Britain, is it? That doesn't take us in places in the future. And that's what I worry about.
Daniel was the person who told us there was no one questioning our position in the single market. So I think on this Brexit issue, we've moved on a long way since then, because the position we're now in is the Brexit Party has taken over a large part of the Conservative Party's support. Let's be clear, the reason why the Brexit Party is doing so well, because it's done a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party. What it's done is yanked the Conservative Party largely in the direction of a no-deal Brexit. So people increasingly looking at Labour as the only voice of moderation and sanity in the whole political spectrum.
Right, but shouldn't you be grateful to the Brexit Party then, Andrew Adonis, on these figures? They would split the Tory vote in a general election and allow Jeremy Corbyn into number 10.
But we've got this big issue before of what we do with Brexit, and that is the single biggest issue facing the country. And to those on the left, the message is very clear. We will not get social justice, the end of austerity, and those things that we want to see in terms of tackling climate change, building houses and all of that, if we spend the next 10
That little
years...
yes of Lord Adonis is hugely significant. If there are any Conservatives voting who think, OK, we can give them a little slap next week and it doesn't really count, the idea that Corbyn doesn't trampoline out of a big election success at the European elections into Downing Street, the idea that this is a completely free hit, that it doesn't have any consequence in the real world, I really hope people think about that.
Of course it has a consequence in the real world. Winning elections is the path to power. That's why I hope people will vote Labour, because at the moment we've got one of the most disastrous governments in office in the history of this country, which all our Conservatives hit us. They want to remove the leader of.
We've come full circle, I think. Thank you to Andrew Hawkins for filling us in on the latest polling figures. There was another big change that happened at the local elections recently, and that was the rise of independents. Our reporter, John Owen, went to Ashfield in Nottinghamshire to find out what happened there.
I don't come from a privileged background or anything like that. I'm just a normal average Joe, to be fair. My 6-year-old actually couldn't wait to go into school on Friday morning last week to say it's mummy counsellor now, it's not mummy.
I was a member of the Labour Party for 23 years, worked for the Member of Parliament until a year ago.
People need to wake up and smell the coffee that they can't just guarantee a vote unless they earn it.
One big theme of the local elections was the rise of independent councillors, local candidates elected without any connection to the main parties. So how many people in this room are independent councillors? Wow. But here in Ashfield, in Labour's former Nottinghamshire heartlands, a mini earthquake saw independents seize overall control of the council, taking 30 of the 35 available seats.
We've capitalised on the national distrust of politicians over Brexit.
So what made people abandon old allegiances and opt for free agents over familiar political brands?
People have always voted Labour here and never seen any difference, and now they have seen a difference through the independents, so I think they're embracing a positive change.
And do you think that the parties at national level should be worried about what's happened in Ashfield, as large numbers of voters have turned away from them and opted for independence?
In a post-Trump, post-Brexit world, no political party should be safe. They shouldn't guarantee anybody's vote, and all politicians of all political colours should have to work for it, and I hope we are the wake-up call that politics needs.
But for Jason, it was the truly local issues that mattered most.
This is one of the things that's symptomatic of what happened in Ashfield. Part of a town centre regeneration, this clock was taken down, originally put up in 1960, so people felt like it belonged to them. You know, they got lots of stories about meeting their first love here or having dates here. Labour took it down in 2014, the public went nuts, it belonged to them, they wanted it back, and they were just ignored. So as soon as we got in power, we dug it out of the depot, got a local builder to pay to refurbish it, and it's back where it belongs. And it's one of those things where big parties just aren't listening to local people anymore.
Labour has enjoyed political dominance in this part of the country for years. Former Labour council leader Cheryl Butler told us that Brexit, rather than local issues, was the main topic on the doorstep. that many of the independents of Ashfield come from major parties, and that despite badging themselves as independents, they often play politics more than others.
Ashfield Labour can blame Brexit as much as they want. It's about a Labour Party locally who stopped listening many, many years ago. Recently, it's become about momentum and the moderates, and every debate, every day is based one side trying to get points on the other. So unfortunately, residents and communities got ignored a long time ago because winning and deselecting became the things that mattered.
Despite Labour's poor performance here, they kept control of nearby Nottingham City Council. But on the High Street, we heard scant enthusiasm for any of the main parties.
Independent goes that back. They go into the swimming pool.
They do get things done. They come round and talk to people.
So could we be living through the end of a political culture of safe seats and loyal voters, and the beginning of something much more volatile? Or is this earthquake just a tremor on the local political scene that will barely register on the national Richter scale?
And we approached the Labour Party in Ashfield, their councillors and former councillors, but no one was available for interview. But, of course, we have the Labour peer, Andrew Adonis. Why do you think this is happening, the rise of independence, and particularly that councillor's point that actually Labour were, in this case, too involved in, who's out, deselection, selection, and not concentrating on local issues?
Well, there's a long and honourable tradition of independent councillors going back to the beginning of local government, and it happens across the country.
There are
some places.
They've got over 600 seats in these local elections.
There's some places in the country where independents from time immemorial have run the councils, and as I see when I look at different places in the country, there are different reasons why you have independents. Sometimes it's because there's a long independent tradition. Sometimes it's because of disputes in all of the different political parties. Sometimes it's very local issues. The thing I was really struck by in that report is there's clearly a big set of controversies about very local issues. You know, the location of the clock in the town centre in Ashfield. Now, we all know from our own communities that there's nothing that generates more passion than those kinds of issues. And all I would say to my Labour colleagues in Ashford is I'd be looking very carefully at that clock.
Right.
It sounds as if that was a big local issue.
So you're not worried about the rise of independence?
Everyone should take note of when the voters speak, and if there are issues which they're raising on the grounds which are leading them to vote for different parties, obviously they should. But I don't think we should think that independents being elected is a bad thing in our political system. It happens across the country all the time.
Ellen?
Yeah, sorry, the irony of that statement, you're saying you're listening when the voters speak. I think it's fantastic that there are an upsurge of independence, and I don't think it's any coincidence that after one of the biggest shake-ups in British politics, the Brexit vote, you suddenly have this spirit, this sentiment that people are saying things can be different, and actually if I don't want to choose between two dead donkeys, I can think of something myself. I think that if we see more of this and the destruction of the two-party system and the crumbling, alongside the crumbling of the main political parties, that volatility that was described is hugely exciting. You know, anything could come in its place, and I think this is a time for experimentation and openness in politics.
I mean, isn't it another nail in the coffin for the two big parties, as Ella says?
Well, in every country, including this one, we've inherited a party system that was invented in an earlier age, a pre-social media age, a more monolithic age, and they're all having to adapt. And so, I mean, the idea that people are looking for more independent-minded local people is great, and if the political parties are listening to that, they will respond by giving more autonomy to their local parties, so that, as happens in the US, as happens in parts of Europe, a national party is more like a confederation of different local interest groups. I think if you did that, and by the way, if the party that is the first one properly to have a link between taxation, representation and expenditure at local level, in other words, properly to devolve self-financing to local councils, is going to be way ahead in the race to win that, because people quite understandably want purpose and meaning to be restored to the ballot box at local level.
I think it's a good thing, but it injects kind of fresh energy into local authorities. But what you have to find is, can they work together? So you often have lots of different independents that have not a lot in common to be able to bring them together to get things done, and lots of arguments. So where I have seen independent candidates or UKIP candidates or Greens that aren't part of the main two-party system, it's been hard to get things done in some of those places. But if you're a Tory candidate or you're a Labour candidate now, the best thing you can do is go local in any election, because the higher you rise into national arguments over momentum, moderates, you leave or remain within the Conservative Party, the higher you get lost away from people. So then people really must go local in elections to have any investment. Social media has done a lot to help these people get their arguments across. If you think about local newspapers or local radio, you wouldn't have heard much from these independent councillors, but now you can connect with them instantly, and I think that's done a lot to help.
All politics is local, and it's very, very important that parties are rooted in their localities. And in all my experience of politics, the parties that do best locally are those that are really plugged into the community and have as their councillors.
So was this a verdict that neither of the two major parties were plugged in?
Both parties have always got to be constantly in touch with their grassroots, and where they are, they generally can contain this surge towards independence.
Slightly cautious about saying that this is all just about local issues. I think actually, as was mentioned in that package, Brexit was central to the question of why people are leaving the main parties. And I think it would be wrong to suggest that people are just thinking within the narrow, scope of their postcodes or their council. That actually, national and international issues are very important to people. And the main issue on the book today is Brexit, and that I think is what is informing people's desire for a new kind of politics. So let's not just make this all about town clocks and things like that. I think people are slightly more forward-thinking than that.
And you can't do anything about that, and your party is your party. The only thing you can try and do is slightly separate. Some of the mayoral candidates actually across the country have done a very good job of having a very small logo attached to them and being on their own platform.
People feel powerless. People feel that it doesn't matter how they vote at local level because nothing ever changes. And to some extent, that's a completely rational thing to feel. And we should be devolving meaningful power to local councils so that we cease to be the most centralised country in Europe and we make local elections matter again.
For once, I'm going to agree with Daniel. I think we do need more power at local level. I'm strongly in favour of directly elected mayors at local level too, which gives local people much more control over their affairs.
All right, we're going to move on because I'm going to show you the Daily Mirror and this article, which says that Labour is to pilot universal basic income scheme for everyone, rich or poor. Our guest on this is Dr. Simon Duffy. He's part of UBI, Universal Basic Income Sheffield, and the founder and director of the Centre for Welfare Reform. Welcome. Tell us what universal basic income is, first of all.
Basic income is really the idea that everybody would be guaranteed an income, individual regular payments up front, so that they can live. So everybody has a right to exist, and that this should not be taken away, or people should not be sanctioned or punished by the state, but should be guaranteed this income.
Right, we'll talk a little bit about that idea of living, existing, if you like, and where the level should be. But your area, Sheffield's been chosen by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, as a site where this idea will be tested out or piloted if Labour forms a government in the future. So you've obviously been lobbying hard. How difficult was it to persuade the Shadow Chancellor to actually take this idea on?
Well, the group, I think you slightly misnamed it. It's UBI Lab Sheffield, and the lab is important. So we're not saying we know the answers or that this will be the perfect solution. We're saying this is a really important idea that we should be testing out, and we think Sheffield is a brilliant place to test that out. The group has existed really, it emerged out of conversations in the city of local people talking about what's important to them. And we've been talking to Labour politicians locally and nationally for a few months. I think John McDonnell's interest in this idea and the interests of many leading thinkers has been around for some time. So it's more of the coming together of two things than the direct result of our lobbying.
Katie, what do you think about this idea? Because to some extent, we have talked about this in the past, but it's always felt as if it was an idea that was perhaps on the sort of margins of political debate. Do you think it's coming into the mainstream a bit more?
No, and I think it's right not to. And I think it's one of those kind of kite-flying exercises that shows that we care about people outside of the bubble. But in reality, there's no kind of costing, how it would be paid for. Why should footballers and bankers receive a basic state payment? Who ends up paying for this? The taxpayer ends up paying for this. I think it's a pretty mad idea. I mean, the lab that we just saw a minute ago is a hive of activity. There's nothing going on behind it, and I think that it's one of those empty kind of ideas that won't go anywhere fast.
That's one of our BBC studios, but anyway, you may be right. But yes, go on, Simon, respond to that.
Well, I mean, that's a ludicrous response to begin with, because there have been lots of tested examples of this, and there's been actually quite effective piloting internationally of this idea. It's an idea that's also being explored for piloting in Scotland. So a lot of that, I'm not quite sure where to begin with. The reason why wealthy taxpayers like the David Beckhams should receive a basic income is it's a bit like the NHS. Everybody should receive the basic guaranteed service, and of course David Beckham et al. Will pay more tax. And there's, without a doubt, it is a form of redistribution, but it's a form of redistribution in the context of an economy which is broken and in the context of runaway inequality. What we're seeing is only the top over the last 40 years, only the top 10 to 15% of the income groups have seen their real incomes increase.
All right. I mean, let's just hang on. One at a time.
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, I was quite interested in this idea because it isn't just the far left that's pushing it. There are all sorts of Californian tech entrepreneurs who are saying it's the way to deal with AI. But it has been piloted. It's been trialled extensively, the most extensive trial being in Finland, which just came to an end last year. And the case is closed. It didn't work. It didn't make people apply for more jobs. It didn't mean that they had the security to go and start the next Google in their garages. I mean, of course, the people getting the money were happy to get the extra money, but it didn't have any of the impacts that the supporters of it were claiming. I have to say, the idea that the economy, we've got more people in work than ever. Every quintile has seen a rise.
There is a debate about inequality, the types of jobs, and so on.
But the way in, the best route out of poverty is a secure, well-paying job, not messing around with schemes like this.
Andrew, but John McDonnell's going to be trying it.
Yeah, we were saying earlier that one of our big problems in our political system is you can't get enough local experimentation and people doing things at local level and seeing how they work. What John McDonnell is doing, I think, is absolutely in the localist tradition. We'll have a local trial, we'll do it in 3 cities, we can then test different versions of it to see how incentives work, what the level should be, what the tax effects are, and then we can take stock. I'm very surprised that, having just come straight out of a debate about how people feel disempowered at the local level, what my colleagues on the panel are saying is, on no account should you allow any local initiative on one of the biggest and most important things affecting people, which is their basic standard of living.
I think the investment of money should be spent elsewhere. So, for example, a local pilot, when anyone can fund a local pilot, how you fund this nationally is something completely different. But also, I'm more interested in those people that are going to work every day, because work should pay. We should make sure that work should pay. It is a better alternative than doing nothing. We should make sure that they are on good salaries and we're up in productivity.
We shouldn't be, but the question I think for me is that this just doesn't go far enough. Because, I mean, the rate at which the universal basic income would come out, the numbers, I mean, it's pretty poor. I'm talking about people's right to exist. I want people's right to thrive, to grow, to have a better quality of life for the future. I think this is phrased in terms of a very radical intervention from John McDonnell. It's not radical.
Well, that's a question. I mean, let's go back to Simon, because you were shaking your head while Dan was responding to you. Why?
Well, I mean, some of those claims are just outrageous.
Which
when
ones?
You think about, well, if you think about, let's take the work capability assessment, which academics have shown has led to increased mental illness and increased suicides and increased tranquilizer use. That's a recent reform to the benefit system. Unemployment is very low, but the level of income that people are receiving is also very low. The UK has pulled off the unique trick of having high employment and high inequality and low productivity. And these things are connected. You will not get a transformed economy if you actually force people into really low-paid jobs and you enable employers not to invest in the capital that will actually improve productivity. So this is a broken
somebody who lives
strategy.
on welfare in the UK now is better off than the average worker in the 1930s. If you'd asked people then about universal basic income, they'd have thought, oh, they've got it already, right? In the 21st century, what we would understand to be universal basic income from their perspective, we've already got it. And the reason that living standards continue to improve, the reason that the hours that you have to work in order to afford basic services continue to drop, is because of the progress and the prosperity generated by a market economy.
Simon?
Go to a food bank and tell them that.
Well, that's an excuse for an argument. Tell that to X is what you say when you don't have
You've created
any logic.
an economy where growing numbers of people are going to food
are you saying that there is
Let's
more poverty now? That there is more poverty on any normal metric of hours worked, of what you being able to afford footwear, clothing? Because saying there are more food banks now, I'm afraid it is not an empirical measure of poverty, as the people who founded the food banks
growing
keep
death
saying.
rates, growing suicides. These things are well documented by the Joseph Rowntree Fund, by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. You could read all sorts of things which will explain to you why the British economy is broken and why social justice in this country
When
is
would
a
you
severe
rather have lived?
crisis.
Do you want to go back 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? When do you think we were better off than now? I'd be interested to hear when you think the golden age.
But Dan, it's not about, if it's just going to say, it's not about, we can compare, of course life is better than it is today than it was in the 1930s. Living standards have improved, but they haven't improved enough. And I mean, if you have lived on the dole, then you know what it's like. It's not a laugh. And not just because it's not enough and people are just about existing, but also because you have no scope for improving the quality of your life. We should be thinking much bigger about these things.
You've got a few seconds, Katie.
I completely agree, actually, that we should be thinking bigger and wider, and just paying people just to sit at home all day probably isn't the answer.
Thank you to Simon Duffy. That's all we've got time for. Goodbye.